Hey guys, Mr. Buckley. I'm just going to talk a little bit about websites and web development, a little bit of vocabulary and some concepts as well. So let's get into it. What happens when we access a website? Well, that's typically done with a browser. A browser is a program, a piece of software on our computer or phone or whatever that we use to visit websites. So this is things like Google Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Safari, things like that. And once you have the browser open, you can type in a URL into the address bar. URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator, and it is the address to the server and the file requested. So when I type in google.com, I'm hoping to connect to google.com server, which is a computer hooked up to the internet that contains files and data. I hope that data will come to me. Of course, Google has many servers, not just one, but that's a topic for another time. Anyway, once a connection is established, the rules by which data is transferred from me to the server and back um, is called HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Sometimes you'll see an S at the end of that. In fact, most times you'll see an S at the end. S means secure, meaning that the data transfer process is encrypted. So if someone were to look at my connection, they wouldn't be able to understand the data going back and forth. That's good for things like payments and passwords and things like that. You want to have the secure thing. Um, so HTTP is the rules by which data is transferred over the internet. You can think of it like the postal service has rules. They have zip codes, and they, organize the post, organize the mail by zip code, and then within the zip codes they have different address blocks. And so they find this address block, and then they find the street, etc. So that also happens with websites. On servers are lots of different files, including HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. HTML files define the content of a website. CSS files define how that content is styled, and JavaScript defines how they are interactive. There's also other files like images and other media and other data. But when you visit a site, these files get sent over to you, and the browser interprets them and displays them as visual media that we can consume. So it shows the HTML in a nice, viewable way. So who builds what in a website? Well, you have different sorts of jobs. You got a front-end developer. They're the ones that use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to code what the user sees and how they interact with it. Typically, they work in conjunction with UX and UI designers. UX stands for user experience, so it's all about how usable and accessible the site is. And then UI designers have to do with the user interface, so how it looks, how it feels, how things are spaced out, how the brand of the company is communicated through the website. All of that comes together to create what we call the front end. Sometimes these three roles are, you know, accomplished by one person or a team of people, and they need to know a little bit of each of them in order to be successful. Now, on the back end, on the server side, you have back end developers. Um, they define the functionality, security, databases, handling of payments, handling of authentication, all those sorts of things. And then sometimes you have developers that are talented in many different ways. They're called full stack developers. Typically, you'll see them at smaller companies. As you get to bigger companies, there's more specialization. But full stack developers can do a little bit of everything, but they usually have a specialty in one area, whether that's a front end or back end area. Now, HTML is what we've been using to define content. It stands for Hypertext Markup Language. The markup part of it are these things called tags. So tags define content and structure. It makes HTML more than a text file. For example, you can use a P tag to define a paragraph, or an A tag to define a link, or an IMG tag to define an image. And you can also use things like div tags to section out different content. There's nav tags for navigation, header tags for header, footer tag for footer, etc. And those can, group different parts of a document together. An element, an HTML element, is comprised of an opening tag, content, and closing tag. So here's an example paragraph element. Sometimes, for example, with image tags, there's no content, so no closing tag or content is needed. It's just the tag itself with its attributes like the image source and the alternate text, etc. A heading is used to define a title for a section. So you have H1, it's the biggest, it's the most important, and H6 is the smallest and least important, and you have everything in between. And the last type of element we'll talk about is a hyperlink, which allows users to visit other websites and web pages. So an example is this would be a link for Instagram. Notice it has this href attribute. An attribute is a detail in a tag to make the tag function properly. And A tags require the href attribute to have a website in it that the link can take you to. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and its job is to style the HTML. So here's an example. If I have an H1 element that says hello, I can style it with CSS by selecting all of the H1 elements and then defining a rule that has the property color and value blue. So in this CSS, H1, the text right before the curly braces, was the selector. Selecting all H1 tags and styling them to be blue. In this example, there is a class selector. A class selector is more flexible. It can be used on different tags. So let's say I wanted an H1 and a paragraph to both be blue. I could define a blue class with this dot and then the name blue. And then I can reference it in my HTML with a class attribute with its value being blue. And then both of those things would have the blue style. So the selector is the thing before the curly braces, and it's selecting all the tags that match, and then applying the styles defined to those tags. Last thing we'll talk about is data use. So copyright means that people own their creations, and we are not to steal them. So this applies to things on the internet like images and media files, etc. There are stipulations like fair use where, for example, a teacher could use a video clip from a movie for educational purposes, things like that. But generally, a good rule of thumb is not to take anything that's not yours, unless it has a Creative Commons license. These are licenses that creators can use to let others use their creations. Typically, there are stipulations. For example, with attribution means that you have to, give credit to the original creator. Non-commercial means you can use it as long as you are not selling it as part of or as a product. With modification means you are free to modify the original work and present it as your own. There's other stipulations as well that different licenses define. You can learn more on creativecommons.org if you want. And then the last thing to talk about is digital footprint. This has to do with the trail of data that you leave by visiting websites, whether it's through cookies or through just user data that they collect on the server side. A lot of websites are tracking at least part of your personal information, and they have privacy policies defined to outline how they track that information. So be aware of how websites use your data and be cautious on the internet. And I hope you appreciate now that you are developing websites, how much work goes into making great websites, and I hope you've enjoyed developing them along the way. So if you have any questions about these concepts, let me know. There will be a test on them soon. Have a great day.